Okay, I lied. We're not going to go on to advertisement yet. Advertisement's coming up, I swear. Don't stress out too much. We will get there. It'll be amazing. You'll stop buying things and simplify your life. Or else you'll just do it more consciously, at least for a little while. Okay, so what I want to talk about right now really links in to this issue of advertising. It links into the issue of working, of society, of our modern everyday life that we just can't skip over. It is such a huge motivator in every aspect of your identity if you are listening to this right now, that it just can't be ignored. That subject is the American dream. I don't know how familiar you are with the formalized concept of the American dream. It is so ubiquitous in its effect in the world that most of us can't really put our finger on exactly what it is or where it came from or why it defines so much of ourselves. We don't even think about it that way. It almost just sounds like a catchphrase, just like something that, would be used as a glittering generality for anything good that happens in your life. But in fact, it's basically the biggest marketing tool that there's ever been. It used to contain within it some grain of truth, and now it is really nothing but marketing, and so let me go into that for a second. The shorthand definition of the American dream is more. It's to have more. More than you have now, more than you were born with, more than the person next door, more. It is limitless. Just like greed, it is not something that declines based on how much you have. The whole notion of the American dream is to never have enough. It's that whatever it is that you have can be improved upon. Now, the way I just phrased it right there actually sounds not so bad. It can be improved upon. The problem is it negates any sort of appreciation for what you have, any sort of a notion of a goal that is really identifiable and accomplishable. Most of us think of the word success, and the word success brings to mind some picture of your future, some picture of some kind of a finish line that you're crossing. Maybe it's in a job, maybe it's in a lifestyle, picturing a certain car, a certain house, a certain life partner type situation. But the point is, it's not very specific, is it? You want to be successful. How do you know? How do you know what successful is? Like lots of people really dream of people of a certain age and brand, I suppose, dream of a certain car, a specific car that they really want, that they feel like if they have this and they're affording this, and then they're a success. As for me, if I could just pick the color of car that I get just once, like if I knew what kind of car I wanted, and I got to go to the place and say, wow, I like this color, this is the one I want, that would be amazing. I just get the car that I can afford, the car that's going to take me from here to there, the one that's not going to break down, the one that my mechanic suggests, and that fits enough of my family. But if I could pick the damned color, I'd be pretty stoked. That's not much of an American dream. Picking the color of your car seems like the bare minimum of any sort of fantasy. And yet, it is so specific and visceral to me that I know that I can probably accomplish that someday. I can probably put the measures in place and measure my distance from it and how far I've come to get there. And I can probably start building up some sort of a savings account and start watching my credit score and get to a point where I know I can walk into a car place and trade in my old car and pick this one and its color. It's probably a Subaru, by the way. I don't know. Maybe a Toyota. Probably a Subaru. They did not pay me to say that. My mechanic, dude. Anyway. The American dream is really about the idea that you can be born in one class, one situation, one economic group, and you can die in one above that. That you can be a self-made person, that you can work hard and you will be rewarded and your life will improve and you will credit it to this free market system, this beautiful, wonderful type of freedom that no other country has ever seen before, right? Now, where it comes from, there's some truth to it. Where we are, it makes no sense. Where we are, it's ludicrous to really pretend like this American dream notion really is going to take shape for somebody statistically. Statistically, you will not die in an economic group above where you were born. Statistically, 94% of Americans will die in the same economic group as the one into which they were born. It doesn't mean their lives won't get better, iPhones won't get stronger, and, cars won't get less electric or whatever you're looking for in a car. That, yeah, consumer goods will get better, but your own personal economy, statistically speaking, is going to stay about the same no matter how much you're making. Just look at me. I have 4 degrees. I have several jobs. I make way more money than I did when I started out 22 years ago. Way more. If I were making this amount of money 22 years ago, I would consider myself pretty well off. Not quite wealthy, but pretty well off. I would be having a house that I want. I would have picked it. I would have picked it for its neighborhood and picked it for its yard and picked it for all these different qualities that I was looking for as some sort of a blueprint for what I wanted. I'd have the car I want, sure. Color, whatever I want. I'd be going on trips. I would have visited every single continent by now. And it would be awesome. Instead, despite how many times more money I'm making now, I'm about as well off as I was back then when I started as a part-time professor. No joke. My expenses have more than kept up. I can bury you in statistics, but if you wait even a month to listen to this, those statistics will be out of date in a depressing way. For a while, during the pandemic, I was living in a nice enough house in Laguna, and we were renting it. And at one point, I read a statistic that houses in this area were going up in value by about $11,000 a day. $11,000 a day. Now, if you're that homeowner, congrats, man. Congrats. You're climbing that ladder. If you're me, the renter, you know that other shoe is gonna drop. You don't report a few things because you don't want to remind the landlords that you're there. And then when finally you just have to, and there's a slab leak and the room is flooded, and they start, calling in some people to leisurely come in and make some estimates, they offhandedly mention, your lease is up next month, and we would like to talk about the new conditions of your lease. They went up by over 30%. Like an insane amount. An insane amount of money that would have sounded fictional 22 years ago. Would have sounded absolutely fictional. So, we moved on. That's one example. And the reason I bring up this example, because the time and place where we are born, there is a giant system that is constantly raising our expenses. And it's incongruous with not only how much you're making, it is incongruous with this idea of inflation. I don't know who is calculating inflation based on what, but you can bet that they are calculating it based on some kind of a very well-off homeowner and probably the return they're getting on their investments, and nothing to do with the average working class American and how much they're spending on gas and rent and electricity and food. Let me give you my favorite example. Again, this is another pandemic inflation thing. So many of them are. I use a particular kind of cat litter. It's crystals. That's a fancy cat. Doesn't step on dirt. It's crystals. I don't know how we got into it. We did. It spreads around a little bit less than the sand. Whatever. At this point, this stubborn cat will not go on anything but these crystals. At the beginning of the pandemic, it was $8.95 for a bag of that cat crystal. $8.95. 4 years later, it's $24. This stuff has tripled in price. Tripled. Like, where is this cat crystal mine where they're pulling these things out of the earth that the prices had to triple? What associated costs are there? Are there workers making 3 times as much money as they used to? Because that would be great. No, they're not. CEO just wanted another yacht or whatever, so he tripled his cat crystal prices, gets his yacht. I don't know why they want yachts. Is it just because they're expensive? Because the thing is just because they're expensive. I don't really want to be on a boat. And if I had an expensive boat, especially like a super fancy expensive boat, I feel like I'd be really embarrassed. But that's because I'm used to comparing myself to my socioeconomic group. In my socioeconomic group, that kind of thing would be a little embarrassing. We'd be afraid to tell our friends about it. The truth of the matter is, part of the design of the American dream is you want to show off your worth through your consumption habits and reach. And you will only compare yourself to those people in your same socioeconomic group. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail as we get into advertising. But essentially, there are markets for different products set at different points for different groups. And you will try your best to excel only in the group wherein you are located. Oh man, I have so many tangents. This is going to be so much fun. So many tangents. Okay, so the reality is that our spending is going up much higher than our wages. Of course, we've been having this discussion about minimum wage for so long that it's gotten so old that if we did even move minimum wage up to twice as much as it was when it started in 2009, we wouldn't be even close to a living wage. Nobody would be able to live on that. Nobody in the United States can live in an apartment in their town for that town's minimum wage. Nobody can. And I know, people say, well, you have to work harder to get more than minimum wage. You have to have an education. You have to do this. You have to do that. Well, working 40 hours a week isn't enough. Does this job need to be done or not? Is somebody on the other end of this profiting from this job? Because if they're not, maybe that job doesn't need to happen. But my feeling is, if I'm making minimum wage and I decide that I need a better job, I need to work harder and get my education and get out of that minimum wage job, that when I leave that job, it's not just going to disappear into thin air. Somebody else is going to step in. They're going to hire somebody to replace me. And what's that person going to do? Work for 40 hours and not make a living. Okay. That's all very grim. It's all very important. I want to give you this background because I want you to look at the American dream through the lens of now, through your experience, through your ideas of what it's supposed to mean and what would be ideal. This is important because it has molded so much of the direction in which you have grown. It has molded so much of what you have been taught in school, the ways you've been socialized, the ways that you've conformed to the people around you, the clothes that you wear, the music you listen to, the car you drive, the hours you work, the degree you sought, whatever. Much of it is based on this idea, this abstract concept of the American dream, which people are not living out statistically. Statistically, you're much more likely to find yourself in prison than you are to find yourself in a socioeconomic group above the one in which you were born. The likelihood of ending up in prison goes way up if you are a person of color. And the likelihood of dying in a socioeconomic group above the one into which you were born goes way down if you're a person of color. The American dream, right? Here's the thing. The American dream comes from a really, kind of interesting idea. It was a good idea. What the heck? Let's just call it a good idea. This was a good idea. America, the United States, once we can look past a little bit of the problematic history, let's place ourselves in some sort of an ideal mind space here where we ignore subjects of conquest and genocide and whatnot, and we look at what things were looking like in the 1800s. And this is really where this idea started to take off. The idea was we were always comparing ourselves to Europe because we kind of felt like this was the center of the world, right? That European civilization, that Western civilization was the direction that the whole rest of the world is supposed to be heading in, that they're behind, right? They're behind. They're not as evolved. They're heading towards Western civilization, but they're not there yet. So that's the pinnacle. That's what we want. Okay. So already we're looking past this idea that everybody was heading their own direction. Everybody was heading towards their own ideas. No, we all thought they were heading towards this one. And if they weren't, we're going to make them. But that's another story. Okay, so America was comparing itself to Europe always. How are things here compared to there? And the truth of the matter is, by the time the Revolutionary War happened, the average farmer in New York had a much better standard of living than the average person in Great Britain did. In fact, the soldiers, as they came over and started taking land back from the colonists during the Revolutionary War, would start occupying these farmhouses, and they were blown away. They had no idea. These Brits fresh off the boat, they had no idea that American farmers were living this way. This was opulent. This was amazing. But we still had this inferiority complex, and it just kept going. This inferiority complex that we don't have the culture and the history and everything, but what we have is scrappiness. We're gonna make it in our scrappiness. Look how scrappy we were that we won the Revolutionary War. Look how scrappy we were the War of 1812. Look how scrappy we were to take over the West with a sort of fraud of a gold rush. That's scrappy, man. Anyway, the idea was that in Europe, you had hereditary wealth. You had wealth that was handed down from one generation to the next, and that basically they had so much money in banks, and banks are lending money and charging interest and whatnot, that if you were born into wealth, you never had to work at all. Working was not your thing because you were just living off the interest of the wealth that your great-great-great-great-grandfather somehow managed to wrest from somebody else's hands at some point. Probably the Crusades. And in fact, it was the wealthy people's idea that it was their job to provide jobs, that they were going to hire so many servants. They were going to build such a big house, which, employs so many people to build. And then they were going to hire so many servants that even those servants would have servants, which at the height of that whole culture, that was the case. And that you were doing your part for your country by employing people in these non-livable wages, spreading your wealth around. But, you're still ending up better off than you were at the beginning of the day because of all that interest. So, the United States, instead of feeling inferior to this, showed them something different, showed them that here, without that hereditary wealth, we can truly be capitalists. And without that hereditary wealth, we are going to have people working really hard to innovate and compete so that they will get more money than the next guy, and they will become self-made men. And that they will work so hard that they were going to be better than they were when they were born, and that they're really a lot of their image, a lot of the idea of what wealth would be is somebody working hard. This has lots and lots of little things tumbling off of it. And when we talk about Barbie, we'll get there. Oh, I can't wait. So remember this. Put a little pin here that the American Dream and Barbie have a really great connection. That'll be a couple weeks from now. So the new stereotype was people working hard and making things better, and that as industry grows, because of this whole industrial revolution situation, that not only would everybody get a bigger piece of the pie by working hard, but that whole pie was going to get bigger. So even the people at the bottom were getting a bigger piece of pie, despite the fact that their percentage may be going down because the entire pie is growing like crazy. So the American dream was you can work at any level, and our collective pie will get so much bigger that even if you go from having, your group of people from having 5% of the pie to having 2.5% of the pie, that's a much bigger pie. So you're going to be good. Now, this is where the rub comes in. This worked really well in the late 1800s with all the industry going on for a lot of the people who had a voice. Weird that your proportion of power also is a proportion of your voice. Your voice, your access to the papers, your access to the history books, your access to all these things where people can actually understand your culture. Eventually the radio, too, and then television. It worked really well for the people who were getting there. And we're talking about, yes, white men. It wasn't working well for anybody else. It wasn't like gangbusters, but there's this idea that people were coming from all over the world to work hard and get themselves part of this success. It just happens to work better for native-born white men than it does anybody else. In fact, women, they couldn't really own anything unless their husband died. That's where we get this myth of the Merry Widow, the Black Widow. It's awesome. Girl bossing is what that's called. So it really was the case that the pie was getting bigger back then too. That the pie was getting bigger all the way through the 50s, the 60s, that this pie was getting so big, people were just benefiting from the runoff of what the really rich people had. So yeah, you were working harder, you were getting better, you didn't have to climb real hard because you were already on an elevator. Now, let me paint you a picture of this. I want to go back to my house in Laguna. I was at a dog park once. I'm in this neighborhood in a dog park and talking to another pet owner. My dog's a jerk. And we were talking about how he had to go to the vet because he is on several anti-anxiety medications. And I was saying, yeah, I really need to kind of check into that again, but it's so expensive to go to the vet. And the guy's like, well, it's worth it. And I said, it can be worth it, but my bank account forbids me. I could go to the vet, but I actually physically couldn't pay even if I skipped everything else that week. Because I have no filter. I just told this guy this. This guy was a boomer. I am not. And this guy looks at me and says, you know what you have to do? I was like, what is it, sir? And he says, you have to buy a house. And I was like, oh? He goes, yeah, buy a house. And I was like, okay. Okay. I'll buy a house. Why do you tell me to buy a house? And he says, look what I did. I was one of the first people to move into this neighborhood. I bought my house in the 1970s. Guess how much? And I'm like, I don't want to guess, sir. This is not pleasant for me. Guess how much? Oh, God. $30,000. $14,000, the guy says. Can you get that? I bought my house for $14,000. Now, at this point, I was nauseated. And he goes on to say, I just had it appraised for $2.5 million. And I was all, oh. And he goes, so see, that's what I'm saying. That's why you need to buy a house. And okay, so I go, okay, well, it's harder to buy a $2.5 million house than a $14,000 house, even if we're changing currency from the 70s to now. He goes, well, that's true, but still. And I go, and plus, let's say you sold that house and you got the profit from that right now. He goes, yeah. I go, okay. So if I'm going to do the same thing as you, I'm going to follow your advice because it's smart and you're wise and white. I'm going to buy a house now for $2.5 million, your house. You get to retire somewhere in the Midwest, and I get to begin amassing wealth like you. I'm a land baron now. I said, do you know how much I would have to sell that house for to make the same profit that you made? And he goes, how much? And I said, over $80 million. And he goes, oh. And I said, yeah. You think that there's a future, even here, where I'm going to be selling your house for $80 million? Or do you think the boomers ran a scam that's gonna fall apart? We weren't friends after this. This is what happens when you're autistic and have no filter and are able to look through somebody's logic so easily because of your bottom-up processing and because you in general aren't very friendly, which we can just credit that to me. We don't have to say that's a neurotype. And it was a sour day. I took my dog. We left. I did not return to the dog park, and it was really because of the dog, not because of my behavior. So there was a time where the American dream was quite real, and it really lasted for so long. And people were watching this thing, World War I and II just increased the whole American wealth thing. And what's great about wars, is that the people who live through them are the ones who tell the stories. So you live through a war, and now you can look back fondly at the camaraderie, at the braveness, at the terror, at all that you came through to get home and find your whole life more profitable than it was. Eventually, through time, these things seem inevitable, like it was always going to go this way, like your friend who died at 19 overseas somewhere for very little reason was always going to die there. That was always going to be part of this story. You were always going to buy a house for $14,000 and sell it for $2.5 million. This stuff was always going to happen. There's safety and security in this notion. There's safety and security because, once again, we're looking at a story. We see ourselves in this story. We didn't write this story. Somebody else told the story to us a long time ago, and we superimposed our own lives into it. We saw through that lens. The tragedies, they weren't tragedies anymore. They were part of the expected outcome of the story. The mustard gassing that your friends got, that was just part of the story. And you grew from it. You moved on from it. You manned up. They all bought the farm, and you did not. So you bought a farm. Both of those are actually literal, different reasons. So this illusion can really hold up in the minds of people with the strongest voices. This illusion can really stay clear, and there's no reason to question a system that didn't let you down. There's no reason to question a system that served you. You don't think things need to change. This is the same reason that teachers rarely change the way that schools go, because they went through this system and they were getting straight A's and they were getting gold stars and everybody was congratulating them and patting them on the back and asking what they wanted to do when they grew up. And they wanted to be a teacher too because it was so meaningful and rewarding. They saw it happen with their own eyes, and they cannot figure out why some students don't get so served well by this. But the ones who do are the ones who learn properly, the ones who learn the right way, because we know that schooling is learning, right? Okay, go back and listen to season 1 if that doesn't make any sense to you. But my point is, the people in power don't want to change things. They want to keep that story going. And through their eyes, it all makes some kind of sense. And when you have the laws molded to your interests, and the people who are in prison are the people who have threatened to change things one way or the other, it all makes a lot of sense. And this story holds. It holds strong. Now, the American dream as a story that guides us, guides our goals, guides our ambitions, guides the ways in which we see ourselves interacting with the world around us, the ways in which we see some notion of destiny, is absolutely necessary to popular culture. It's the basis of it. It is an inspecific dream of more. It is something that is not accomplishable because it has no roof. It has no ceiling. More just means more. More until you die. Constantly more. One more step. One more step. If it didn't mean that, if you had a measurable goal, if there was a place where once you got to that point, you stopped, and now the accumulated wealth started going to other places because you had already won, there'd be a lot more for a lot more people. Because the pie that got bigger and bigger eventually is getting outpaced. It's getting outpaced. And I'm not just preaching some sort of a political point of view here. I am looking at the most profitable country in the world with a terrifying school system, terrifying wealth inequality, the highest percentage of people in jail. It's a lot. Despite all of our freedom, we have 2.2 million people in jail, something like that right now. 2.2 million. Yeah, the American dream. So I'm not just trying to be cynical. I'm trying to pull on the thread that makes the sweater transform into a piece of yarn that was in a really elaborate knot so you can better see what we are constructing ourselves from. How we have taken all of these stories and made ourselves out of them. Fashioned our efforts, fashioned our ideas, fashioned our dreams. Who would you be somewhere else some other time? Who would you be? What would you want? What destiny would you have if you knew that right now that you were supposed to grow up and be a rock star, you were supposed to grow up and be a publisher, you were supposed to grow up and be a lawyer? What would that look like in the 1600s? What would that look like 5,000 years ago in China? Who would you be in one of these other places? Well, everything changes, doesn't it? All of it. So it's simple to accept who I am, my name, my place, my race, my history, my wants, my desires, my gender, all of that subjective. All of that's a story. So let's pull some of this apart. Let's pull some of this apart piece by piece, brick by brick, until we try and uncover how you got here. It's fun to do this, I swear. All right, I swear. I'm not going to swear we're going to get advertised next time, but I think we will.